Okay, let's kick off. When I started speaking to you this morning, it was bright and sunny outside. Now it's dark. I'm sure, like me, many of you had a wonderful day with a lot of rich discussions, a lot of interaction, co-creation, new ideas, bridge building. And I'm very delighted to welcome you to this closing plenary session. Once again, on behalf of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center and all our partners, which include the International Institute for Environment and Development, Dan Church Aid, the Wellcome Trust, Global Resilience Partnership, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to have an exciting set of closing discussions to fully wrap up this really exciting day. And so that we can start looking ahead to COP. We're going to begin with a report back from our wonderful graphic rapporteur, Jorge, who's been busy behind the scenes making notes and graphics from all the rich discussions that have taken place. We're then going to have a hard talk led by a famous former journalist, Laurie Goring, who's going to grill our colleagues and ask them what really stood out for them, what they're going to take away from the D&C Days. I'm then going to ask Dr. Tom Mitchell, director of IIED, to have a conversation with people representing the negotiation side of things. And we are then going to have an interactive exercise with all of you. And then we're going to see Jesper from the Global Resilience Partnership give us a little preview as to what we can expect in the Resilience Hub at COP30. And we're going to close the session with a very exciting performance from Harm and Eugenia, who are going to give us a Hamishibai performance. With that, I'm going to hand over to Jorge. Jorge, the floor is yours for about 6 minutes.
Oh, hello again. Our energy levels, we are nearly done today. So I'm just going to take you through the second part of the day. So let's start with zooming on section 4, if I manage to do that. For some reason I can't. Oh yeah, there we go. So reflections and insights. It was said that loss and damage was something that was missing from conversations earlier in the day. And loss and damage is about taking responsibility for your past actions. Climate finance is not charity. And then LLD is critical, and nature-based solutions are very important. I realize that my idea of a nature-based solution can be very naive. It's just someone taking shelter under a tree when it's very hot. But you get the idea, right? Nature-based solutions. And then we moved on to trust-based grants, and you said what this meant to you. It meant innovation. It meant agility, relationships, flexibility. It's community driven. There was a lot of talk about the need of going back to a co-creation approach, about the need to unlearn many things. There was this concept of citizen innovation where everyday people's creativity is enabled, not directed by institutions. So that is my take on that section, trust-based grants. And then we heard about philanthropic strategies. And one of the takeaways from that is that philanthropics need to commit to longer term, more flexible funding. And also we heard that we need to further draw on the rich knowledge that communities have as philanthropies make decisions on grant making. And because this is happening in Brazil, I thought there may be some reference to the Amazon and its people and nature, animals, etc. could be relevant here. So how can we draw on the rich knowledge of these local communities? And then the final blocks were one was about grounding the GGA, and so I heard that we need standardized frameworks to measure adaptation, while we also need to be flexible enough to incorporate local perspectives. So you need to have your checklist and check items within standardized framework, but you also need to be able to listen to local communities. So both are important. And we heard that for some people, current indicators often require specialized knowledge that some national teams don't have access to, so they don't understand these indicators. And the final block was about financing nature and locally led action, the role of the private sector. And one of the takeaways from that is that generating sex and gender disaggregated data is important for understanding the economic benefits that nature-based private sector solutions can bring. And also, we heard that public funding should be used to bridge the gap between grassroots and the private sector. And I know other things were said, but these were my most salient points for the day. I mean, and just like that, that's it. These are the takeaways from today. We're just missing
so much.
The final reflections.
Yeah, we're acutely aware that we need to fill that bottom right box on what's ahead. Hopefully this plenary will give you that. Jorge, a huge thank you for doing such an excellent job. I'm always deeply impressed with your skills and capabilities on essentially developing a graphic novel from what I'm sure were quite complex, quite sometimes quite technical discussions. You can see all the love pouring in for you and your work, Jorge. Thanks once again for being part of the Development and Climate Days. All right, moving swiftly on, I am delighted to welcome to the closing plenary Laurie Goring, who's a former journalist. She was with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and she's going to lead the next segment on Hard Talk. Many of you would be familiar with the format of Hard Talk. We've rolled it out a few times at the D&C Days. This is when one interviewer asks tough, penetrating, difficult questions to a group of respondents. Laurie, the floor is yours in a minute, but let me introduce the people who are going to be subject to your torture. The first is Tracy Kajumba, who's director of the Life AR Secretariat. We have Anna Heath, who's senior programs manager at Synchronicity Earth, and Lina Yassin, climate policy researcher at IIED. Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, teacher. I will, yes, I'll be grilling our panelists, but gently, not trying to scare anyone away too much. So let me start with Anna. And I would ask you all if you can keep your answers as short as possible so we can get through as many of these tough questions as possible. Anna, as someone focused on conservation, you sit outside the circle of many of the people here at D&C Days. How do you see the push to rapidly boost adaptation differently than them? What do you honestly think are the prospects for adaptation, especially for the people that are most in need of it?
Thank you, Laurie. Yeah, so my perspective on adaptation is always, I suppose, kind of nature first, because my bread and butter is biodiversity conservation. So firstly, we're kind of thinking about how do we support ecosystems to adapt, and then what does that mean for our broader societies. I think from many of our partners, nature and people are not separated things, right? That's that we are together, and that is something that is really important to remember. That adaptation, from my perspective, I think is about biodiversity. Strong biodiverse ecosystems are our strongest ally in bringing adaptation to the fore.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And there's been a lot of demand for funding that's really, flexible and responsive for a long time. But today, in a lot of these sessions, there was so much talk about the problems that are still there, with compliance and difficult forms and lack of flexibility if you need to change direction in the middle of a grant. How far do you think we've really gotten in shifting that? Like, how do we unlearn what we've done in the past?
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. I think we've gotten a lot, like in my perspective, from the last 2, 3 years, there's been quite a big push in understanding the need for that. But now it's the practicality of doing it that's the challenge. So I think my, colleagues in our networks of other foundations are really trying to look at how they can do this better, but they're coming up against kind of practical roadblocks in the way that their whole organization is set up to move some of this stuff forward. I think something else is about kind of who is convinced. In my experience, foundation staff are very often convinced, but maybe not their boards, for example, which are really key players in this. Not always, but that can be the case. So I think we are moving, but I think the practical measures needed to actually bring that flexibility into grant making, there's more needed there.
Okay, that makes sense. Lena, let me turn to you for a second. We've heard from the speakers today that the global goals on adaptation are still a work in progress, that there are still some inconsistent views between the negotiators and the technical experts, and plenty of goals that still need methodologies and so on. And then, of course, if we get them here at the next COP, then they've all got to go home to the countries to match up to their own systems, which isn't all that easy. So how do we take whatever happens at COP30 on the global goal on adaptation and make it more than just symbolic? How do we do it quickly enough with climate threats growing so swiftly?
Thank you, Laurie, and thanks for having me. I think from our discussion today on the global goal on adaptation, one message is clear. We don't need another layer of reporting, and this is not what the global goal on adaptation should be. What the global goal on adaptation should be is building on the existing mechanisms. One thing that we fail to do at the international level and the global goal might be heading towards is pushing things towards the local level without the understanding that systems already exist. People already make decisions on a daily basis on resilience and adaptation and have their own systems. We've heard great examples from the Caribbean region. We've heard examples from Vietnam about how these systems have been in process and have been shaping and learning. And I think the way to ensure the DGA actually gets us to tell the story of adaptation is by making sure the connection exists between what's happening at the local level and the global assessment of that progress. So the DGA needs to shift its thinking from being the answer to all to being the connection between the reality on the ground and the global policy level.
Interesting. And, I think we're hearing some people suggesting today that there's things like, the frameworks around the Sendai framework and the SDGs and so on that you don't have to build from scratch. Do you think that makes sense? I mean, how much can be adapted from other things and what can't?
I think if there's anything we agree on all in adaptation space is that adaptation itself is an iterative process. You learn by doing, and there's a lot of scaffolding that exists. And the conversation today, we've had people from the Sendai framework, the UNDRR, you're right, and the SDGs. So there is scaffolding in place. And I think it's important to build on these systems because as much as we do want to make sure the focus is adaptation and the stories of adaptation makes its way to the global level, we need to rely on decades of experience that the SDGs have. We know there are a lot of lessons that are valuable and are relevant that we can take from these processes without looking like we're just relabeling existing systems. So it's that assurance that this is a system built for adaptation and it's not just recycling of all targets, and giving that assurance to countries, I think will help us move on from the skepticism that the UNDRR and the SDGs are trying to take over again. So it's that delicate balance to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is let's assume that we do make good progress on the global goal at COP30. What does that get us if money to actually do the adaptation is so short globally? Can it actually drive anything important?
I think there's one thing that is really key here to remember is that indicators do not change life. They capture the progress, they capture the story, but they do not themselves rebuild schools that were washed away or help the farmers' crops that are failing. And I think this is where we're failing to understand that if COP30 gives us indicators, that's not the end of the story. That's not something that we should celebrate and take forward. That needs to come as part of a package of promises to deliver on finance, accessible finance in the forms of loans and grants. And I think this is where we can build a comprehensive package that doesn't just give us indicators to measure the story, but also give us means to then make that change happen on the ground in reality. So you're absolutely right. It's not, we don't want just a list. We want more than that. And I think we might find ourselves stuck in back and forth about, oh, which indicators, how many? Do we get 20? Do we get 50? And forget that without other things and other key elements, this won't change lives at all.
But you think indicators can work maybe to drive money? Are they helpful in any way to do that or not?
Absolutely. I think because when we think about adaptation, and adaptation finance, we think about it as this broad category, but adaptation is health, it's water, it's agriculture, it's cultural heritage. So indicators in that sense help us understand what is underfunded and where money should be channeled, but also help us understand what is working well and what should we continue to channel money towards so that we can learn from that. So I think it's about the nuances that are right now not being captured at a global level and can help us understand adaptation beyond not just one term.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, Tracy, we're 20 years into D&C Days and still trying to get adaptation centrally into the COP agenda, and into real world action, even as these climate impacts get much more serious and much more obvious to everyone. And finance is clearly a big issue, but we're still, talking after many years about the need for building local capacity, working more collaboratively rather than competitively, devolving decision making. How are we really making progress at scale on any of those things? And how could we do it better?
Thank you, Laurie. I think that's a tough question. And I'm not saying we're not doing anything. A lot is going on and appreciating the institutions who are investing in these processes. But I want to quote the title of the Adaptation Gap report for this year. It says running on empty. I looked at it as like, oh my God, this is not good. So we are not doing well. And of course, from the previous conversations, that the LDCs, for example, have been calling for doubling for adaptation from the Glasgow COP to 40 billion. But the report for this year is giving us figures of 28 billion, and the need is 310 billion, 12 times the gap of what is needed for the developing countries. So the gap is still massive. The new quantified goal, we know that has not been achieved. The COP30 Circle of Finance Ministers in Washington were looking at the roadmap from to Belém with 1.3 trillion, which is massive. It's nice by 2035. But the question is, if we are running empty, are we going to fill the basket by then? So it's still a big question on financing. And what it means in practice is that for developing countries that are already underfunded, and the figures now are putting 59% of the funding as loans, and we know debt sustainability is a big problem for developing countries. That is going to get worse with the situation that we are in. But what I've heard today across the sessions, I think we are going back into reflective mode of how can we do adaptation better by collaborating, by getting local voices into the conversations, by harnessing resources domestically and across different areas, but also the issue of equity, I think, is something that really comes to me on which countries need what, because most of the things we are talking about, country platforms to mobilize finance, there are differences between middle-income countries, developing countries, seeds, and others. In one of the sessions, I think there was good contribution on can we not use a one-size-fits-all? so that the funding is going to, if we are pouring loans into developing countries, and we know that adaptation does not have return on investments, then we are making it very difficult for them in the future to even work on public sector goods because they'll be servicing loans. So I think looking at these funds, what do middle income countries need? If they get loans and can service them, but then what do seeds LDCs need in terms of either concessional loans or grants? But also, I think we need to think about informal multilateral mechanisms of mobilizing finance, even within LDCs, within countries, because it's a big problem. The focus now is on private sector with little hope that private sector is going to come out or to provide funding for adaptation that will be sufficient. So a blend of funds across the board, philanthropy, private sector, domestic funding, I think is needed because we're dealing with a crisis. And the funding is not enough, definitely. And it's been a story for many years.
Yeah. And so how do you make the case to the the few funders that are out there to that this is something that should be a bigger priority, that needs to move up, that's going to impact them more in significant ways? How do you change minds on this? Are you seeing anything that works?
For fear of annoying possibly some of the funders that are here, it's not intentional since we've been doing this at D&C Days, had conversations. I think it's not even that we don't have any funding. Some of the funding is there, but the rules and bureaucracy of accessing those funds for the developing countries, for small organizations, grassroots organizations, are so massive. It takes years and years to access funding, for example, from multilaterals. And the climate crisis is increasing. It's not waiting for anybody. But then you need to produce these reports and assessments and the frameworks. And my God, it takes so long. And adaptation is not waiting for anybody. The crisis is increasing, emissions are increasing, situations are getting worse. But then we are looking at more of accuracy than efficiency at the end of the day. So I know some of them are trying reforms. In Layfair, that's what we are doing, trying to challenge multilateral funds, for example. Can you ease the reforms? Can we work with systems that are already existing? If we have one accredited organization, can others use that organization without repeating the due diligence 5 times because it's a different funder? So the ways of working really need to change. We need to work in different ways because the climate crisis is not waiting for anyone. So there's a lot that funders could do in terms of flexibility, in terms of trust, that the funds they're giving are going to do the right thing. So easing the mechanisms and reducing the bureaucracy could move us forward as we mobilize more funding.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That really makes a lot of sense. I appreciate the answer on that. And back to you, Aditya. I'm afraid that's all the hard questions we have time for today.
Great. Laurie, thank you so much for leading this segment. Really interesting, really penetrating insights. A quick question for you, Laurie. You're a you're a Development and Climate Days veteran. One surprising thing that you heard today?
Oh gosh, there were so many of them, I think. Let me look at my notes. No, honestly, I was really interested in a lot of these sessions, and let me find this last one. Some of the things, it's always so frustrating to me exactly what's been talked about there with Tracy, that that we still have these complicated forms and these really difficult systems, and that I think as the funding is so tight now, I keep hearing that it's actually getting worse rather than better, that we seem to be regressing on some of that among some funders because they really need to make sure that with the limited funds available that they can show that it's doing the right things. And that's a bit depressing to hear about, but I really do think if you're going to try to move money to the front lines, that's where the changes need to happen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Laurie, once again, thank you so much for being with us and for contributing to the closing plenary. Okay, moving swiftly on, I'm going to now invite Bettina Coel, my colleague from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, our head of innovation and engagement, back into the plenary. where she is going to ask all of you a couple of quick questions. Just to underline, these questions that we're going to ask you using Mentimeter will be used to frame the discussion that we will be having as representatives of the Development and Climate Days at a specific session at COP30 that Jesper is going to tell you about more towards the end of this session. Bettina, the floor is yours for about 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. In fact, the floor is, I think, all of ours to really share what shall we do. So we talked a lot about slow progress. We talked about complexity. We talked about some new ideas. We had sessions calling for unlearning. We had sessions calling for a very different rethinking of how funding and adaptation finance may be provided. So up to all of us, if we act now, what is it that we would be doing? And this is where we would really like you to very short and sharply think a little bit about, if it's according to you and it's anonymous, with COP in mind, what action do you think should we be taking going forward? What are the couple of things that we should be taking forward? I think there are a couple of obvious ones that we already heard, but maybe there are some more hidden ones. So please, if you could go there and share with us, what actions do you think should we be taking? Be generous with your ideas and thoughts. We only have a couple of minutes, but they will be taken to Belém, where we can actually really infuse it into the D&C Day session that we are having there. And I'm going to quickly switch screens because the first ones are coming in. And we can all see them right here. So we have the first one. First prize for the quickest thinker. Keep raising the issue that we believe, the issues that we believe in. I think it's a nice one to say, let's not give up and be disheartened. Underline the critical importance of filling the adaptation gap. Move to action. Show up for each other. Show up for adaptation and development, making it clear that this is an urgent priority. I really love that. Solidarity and urgency. Rhetoric to reality. Finding the key messages that resonate across the wide group of actors we have gathered here and push them hard. Really nice. Demanding tangible actions, not new shiny initiatives and press releases and posturing. Sing louder. I love that, especially linking to the opening plenary where we hopefully sang loud in front of our computers, all of us. Can we regroup over what we really need to achieve and move to implement it? Really nice. Make clear the finance and human cost of not doing this. Be prepared the forces of inertia and blockage that may come. There's a bit of doom there for us to keep in mind as we move to COP and beyond. Consistently treating the climate and biodiversity crises as two sides of the same coin. We cannot address the one without the other. The energy and connections of today combined with the energy we felt at CBA 19. More singing louder. I think it's maybe the ask is for the connection and one voice. That is really powerful. Share stories of actions. I think we'll leave this open for a bit longer. So feel free if you're typing still to submit these still. But I think these are some really nice and concrete actions. Some more radical than others. Keep billionaires out. Very interesting suggestion there for action. But I think really a fantastic basket of actions looking at solidarity and focus, I think I would like to say. So thank you so much. We will document all of these. I'll stop share the screen and hand over back to you, Aditya.
Bettina, thanks a lot. Some really exciting, useful suggestions there. Others, I'm not really sure what we do with that, COP, like sing louder. Maybe we can sing in that session. I'd love to hear what Jesper has to say about that in a minute. All right, I'm now very, very pleased to welcome our next set of interjectors. This conversation will be led by Dr. Tom Mitchell, who's the director of the International Institute for Environmental Development. And we're really privileged that talking to him will be Dr. Fazle Rabbi Sadiq Ahmad, who's the Deputy Managing Director of PKSF in the Ministry of Finance, Bangladesh. He's led the climate finance negotiating team for the country for many years, hugely experienced negotiator. And we have Cristina Rubitas Del Rio, an old friend of the Development and Climate Days. She's a senior advisor for adaptation and resilience at the UN Foundation. And this is my description of her: a key enabling force for the global goal on adaptation. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aditya, and good afternoon, evening, morning to everybody. Been fabulous to listen to D&C Days today and engage in some of the conversations. Thank you. Just to kind of riff off Laurie's last interjection about some of the things that continue to surprise her, I do wonder whether as a community, we should actually come up with a single application form for every type of funding, one document that we can design ourselves, rather than let those holding the money do the design, because that hasn't worked. So anyway, just a thought about that as one piece of action. But this this moment in the kind of the afternoon closing session is really just an opportunity to think forward. 3 weeks' time, we're at the end of the COP30 in Brazil, and many of the, I suppose, the dreams that we might have about what can be achieved have been met. And I'm going to ask Rabbi and Christina to give us a sense of what their dream outcome could be. And then we'll go on to think about what we need to take out of the way in order to be able to achieve that. But Christina, maybe I can start with you, and you can give us a sense of then what does that kind of super successful outcome for COP30 when we think about adaptation, resilience, and development feel like for you at this point?
Yeah, I'll start with the big picture. I mean, obviously, the money needs to show up. We want to see pledges. We want to, and not just pledges, but financing actually getting delivered. We want to see new adaptation finance goal that's ambitious and actually shrinks the adaptation finance gap and puts a dent in it. We want to see philanthropy showing up as they haven't. Maybe they can do more. We want to see the private sector coming with ideas and ready to do the work in partnership with governments and civil society to deliver solutions. So at the very macro scale, new finance commitments and action, and ideas coming together with people to drive them. At a more negotiatory scale, there's work to be done on the global goal on adaptation, as we've been discussing. It's been around for 10 years. We've been putting in place progressively more and more detail, targets and now indicators. But we really need to, one, agree on indicators to measure progress that really tell us where we're making progress, where we're not making progress, where the gaps are, what we need to do differently, but also hold accountability. It needs to be a tool for accountability. And then we really need to shift to implementation. The first target is due in 2 years. And so we really need to shift to the real world of implementation and the hard world of implementation. And beyond that, I think, and I'm actually really hopeful for this COP, because I think changes in the air around the narrative, around adaptation, around the political importance of adaptation. And I think that's a third important signal that can come from COP, along with the money and the progress in the negotiations and in the sort of architecture for the GGA, is adaptation brought up by countries as much as the mitigation targets? We're already seeing that over 170 countries have national adaptation plans in progress or in place. We're seeing that more than 70% of the nationally determined contributions reflect adaptation actions in them, even though it's completely voluntary, according to UNFCCC rules, but according to the rules of logic, completely necessary. And so we're seeing countries prioritize adaptation. We're seeing it rise on the agenda as a vital priority. Now we just need the political rhetoric, the planning, and the financing to really act as one to enable implementation. So That's my wildest dream
Yeah,
for
thank you,
COP
Christina.
in a
There's a lot
nutshell.
there. There's a lot there,
There's a
and
lot
we'll
there.
come on to
Sorry.
think about what some of the barriers to that will be in a moment. But you've already mentioned that, from those that are sitting in kind of key government decision-making spaces and negotiators, particularly those in ministries of finance, are really thinking hard about the future of resourcing all the things that they need to do. And that gives me great pleasure to pass to Rabi Ahmed. Rabi, you're very much at the heart of negotiations on adaptation-related issues, and from a finance perspective, what's your sense of a kind of a dream outcome from COP30?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. And Christian already shared her views on that. In fact, this COP actually is it's third COP30. That means 29 COPs already hold. Last COP was the finance COP, but I think in this COP our expectation is not too high. Our expectation was high for the last COP, but let's talk with what is happening for the last few years. In fact, NCQG, our expectation was high, particularly dedicated funding for adaptation, dedicated funding for vulnerable countries, and quality money for adaptation. But nothing has happened last COP. So naturally, the discussion on financing should be based on the outcome of the NCQG. But rather on that, whatever the decision was taken for the last few, for example, there was a decision in the Glasgow COP, the adaptation finance should be double within 2025. I think it is not happened. And another, actually, globally, there is a calculation on financing. The adaptation financing is the 5 to 10%. And we are repeatedly calling global community that there should be balanced allocation between adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. But ironically, for some reason, adaptation in maximum cases, the grant-based financing is feasible for adaptation. There is no business on that, and adaptation actually could not generate any kind of benefit for the developed countries. So somehow it is ignored, and I think too much ignored. And only one dedicated fund for adaptation, that is adaptation fund. But if you see the statistics from the beginning, it started its work from, I think, 2005 up to now. For 150 countries, total money generated around 1 to 2 billion. For 20 years, for 150 countries, dedicated funding for adaptation is only 1 to 2 billion. So it's actually significantly imbalanced and significantly ignored funding. So I think we have rhetoric for the last 29 COPs, but if you could not show any kind of significant impact on adaptation financing, I think maybe in future, the multilateral negotiation, trust, global leadership on it will be seriously hampered in future. Maybe some countries in this year, our government is too much pessimistic to attend in the COP. Our minister, our secretary are not going there. Only very limited negotiators are going, because that is no enough outcome on that, and we are not getting any benefit. And gradually, some other vulnerable countries as well, gradually gradually losing their interest to attend the COP and participate in the COP. This is down. I think, although it is happening, but I think the vulnerable country, the least developed country, might not important in global level, but if they ignore, then the multilateral process will be seriously hampered in future.
Thank you. That gives us a pretty bleak assessment of the situation, but one I think that many people will kind of chime with and recognize that there have been continuous targets and pledges that have not been met from the past. And so I suppose the kind of translation of that into a dream is that finally countries step up and meet the pledges that they've made in the past, the commitments that they've made in the past, and that adaptation is a balanced focus and outcome when it comes to finance and other areas. So thank you for that. And I think the last thing we want to see is that the entire trust in the process ebbs away so people don't come anymore. That's clearly a big barrier to multilateralism. But Christina, I'm just thinking back to the kind of the dream that you outlined as well, the kind of sense of multiple different partners coming to the table, different parties, different funders, and recognizing their role, and that the GGA is a kind of key enabler of that. But what do you see in this COP of some of those kind of barriers to success, and how can this kind of D&C Days community help to move the barriers out of the way?
That's a great question, a tough question. I'm an optimist at heart. But we do need to think about the barriers. I think the biggest one I'm worried about, I'll put in the category of procedural mayhem, having witnessed what just happened at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, a couple of weeks ago in London, where a vote to adjourn was muted by Saudi Arabia, and that passed, and that was the end of discussions, and decisions were postponed for a whole year. Between the US and other forces that aren't very keen on climate action, I think there's potential for procedural mayhem, and I think we need to be prepared for what those are and what the countermeasures are. And so we need to be very skilled, and parties need to be talking to their lawyers and looking very carefully at different potential scenarios to be prepared. And maybe that's something that this community can help deal with. The second issue is the passing of the buck, which I think Rabani described it, and I think is already happening, where donors will say, well, we really can't increase our commitments or make longer term commitments, ODAs being cut, hard financial situations, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe the private sector can save the day. Maybe the multilateral development banks can save the day. How about philanthropy? Maybe they can save the day. There is, and the requirement is that we need all of those to be working in tandem, and working together. But there's a little bit of a passing of the buck that is happening, and I think the fact that there's a tough economic environment across much of the world doesn't mean that adaptation financing needs can go on hold or are reducing in any way. And so, as I think Tracy said, we need to work smarter and in more partnership. I think a third issue is the fragmentation. It's a big agenda. I feel for parties that have only a few negotiators coming. You're going to be running between rooms, and then that's used often strategically. So we can't talk about finance in the adaptation rooms. That's talked about in other rooms. We can't talk about accountability and transparency. That's somewhere else. And so that fragmentation of the rooms, that fragmentation of the agenda, doesn't help. But one thing I think this D&C Days community can really do, it's always been a source of energy, optimism, ideas. It's been a boost. It's been an uplift, always throughout the years, at least for me, to recharge, but also to reflect and reorganize. And so I think it's advantageous that we're having this before COP, so we can strategize together a bit more ahead of time. But let's also reconnect during, because it will require a lot of on the fly pivoting, as it were. Thanks,
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, and I think the point that you're making about passing the buck, I always find an interesting one, where people say there's just simply not enough money around to support adaptation. I like to remind people then that if you take the top 5 biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, then that equals something in the order of $8 trillion of money under management. And so even if you were to take 1% of that, and to go back to Rabi's point about the total amount of receipts on adaptation finance, then you will have immediately kind of rapidly changed the situation. So in some ways, it's a question for me about prioritization and how to think about distribution of wealth and so on. But Rabi, can you build off what Christina's highlighting here and just think about what some of those key barriers are to success and the way that you'd like to wave them out of the way or push them out of the way and how we can help?
Thank you. Sorry for that. In fact, Tom, I think at this moment, first we need to build trust. Whatever we decided for the last few COPs, I think it is the time to implement that decision. For example, doubling adaptation, it should be implemented properly. And furthermore, what in the last NCQG, we have some suggestions from least developed countries group. The windows of UNFCCC. Actually, these windows were developed for the working for so many years with global partners. We introduced the Green Climate Fund, we introduced FRLD Adaptation Fund. But these windows, total money from these windows is only 1 to 2%. Maximum money flows to the multilateral development bank, bilateral, private sector. But as you see, this is a multilateral process. We are in the COP process. We created some funds with lots of talking, with getting some ideas, but only 1 to 2% out of the 100 billion money flowing through these funds. It is not actually, it is not using its full potential. We like this fund because we have the representation on that body. For example, in Green Climate Fund, we have one representation out of 24, although one is not enough, but still we have some saying on funding. But whatever coming through private sector, whatever coming from multilateral development bank, we don't know. And we don't have any saying on that. It is completely without, we don't have any participation on that money. So I think that the quantity is not only important, quality is also important. And for ensuring the quality, that means for adaptation, if we give the market-based loan, it does not create any kind of value. Furthermore, it may create debt burden for climate vulnerable countries. So quality and ensuring the quality, particularly on adaptation financing, money flow is in terms of quantity is low, and furthermore quality, around 70% of adaptation finance is loan, and out of that, maximum money is loan, market-based loan. So it doesn't mean anything, in fact. So whatever we actually taking decision, I think implementation with maintaining the proper quality is very important. Otherwise the impact in the field level will not create any kind of
we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
But I think what I'm taking from that very clearly is that if there are loans available to countries that are just at the market-based rates available on a kind of commercial market, then that's not adaptation finance. That is just regular finance ministry borrowing, but we have to be very careful to ward away from that. But thank you to Christina and to Rabi. I think that gives us a sense of what we can hope for at COP, but equally what we need to make sure we're very vigilant on. I'm a little spooked by Christina's procedural challenges that she's outlining, and I think it would certainly be good to think through how to counter those. But I'm going to take the optimistic view and dream as well, because I think there's a lot of implementation action going to be talked about at COP and not just airy-fairy commitments. And that's going to be really important. Aditya, back to you, but thank you so much for the time and attention.
Tom, thank you so much for leading such a useful discussion. Dr. Salim Haq, one of the founders of the Development and Climate Days, was very keen that the D&C Days does not take place in a bubble, in isolation from the hot topics that are on the tables of negotiators. And I think it's segments like these that help us connect what's happening here with what's going to be happening in the negotiating rooms. With that, I'm going to now invite Jesper Hornberg, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Resilience Partnership, to talk about the segment on development and climate days that's going to take place at the Resilience Hub at COP30. As I said this morning, the development and climate days this year is an anomaly. Usually the D&C Days take place on the middle weekend in person of every COP. However, for a number of reasons, including the fact that the middle weekend is going to witness a large mobilization of indigenous groups in Belém, we decided to host this online, also allowing us to strategize ahead of COP. But we will be complementing this online discussion with an in-person event at COP, which Jesper will tell you more about. Jesper, the floor is yours for about 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How do you come in after this discussion and this day? I don't really know. I just want to quickly echo something that Tom said, which is optimism. There is real power in optimism. And yes, we know that it's a pretty big lift we need to do, and coming together like this, realizing we are one community and we can work together and build trust and collaboration, I think is critical. We do have on the 15th, so that's over the weekend, in Belém, in the afternoon, late afternoon, we have an event, or rather the D&C will have an event, which we're very happy to host at the Resilience Hub. It will be a lively recap of the discussions here and whatever comes from it. We will be a week into COP, and we will be 2 weeks after Sao Paulo started. So I think there's much more we can discuss there. There will be some fun activities, so do please show up and spread the word. Now at the Resilience Hub, we will have over 60 events in total, and I know that many of you are involved in them. So I look forward to seeing you there. Yeah, if I can just end on an optimistic note, you know, let's sing louder, let's be brave, let's dare to think positive. We know it's heavy, but together, you know, we can lift quite a lot, which is what we have to do. There is no real option. I feel honored to finish, almost, maybe there's a final word coming, but I feel honored to finish this very rich day. Jorge, thank you so much for summarizing the discussion so well, and thanks for organizing these days. Thank you.
Jesper, thank you for your partnership with the Development and Climate Days. So that's 5:30 p.m. on Saturday, the 15th of November, an in-person event at the Resilience Hub in the Blue Zone at COP, for those of you who will be there in person. Jesper forgot to mention the most important detail, which is the Resilience Hub is known for its fantastic coffee. So not only will you enjoy the scintillating discussions, you can also have a nice, hot, revitalizing cup of coffee. I will now invite Bettina back to introduce our fantastic performers for the evening. Bettina, I've had the privilege of seeing Harm and Eugenia last year at the Development and Climate Days, but over to you for a short introduction.
Thank you. Very brief. We heard quite a bleak picture on fragmentation and mayhem, and really quite a challenging situation we are facing. And I want to say, echoing also what Jesper has been saying, and we heard before, it becomes even more important to show solidarity, to think creatively and not to be paralyzed and sit like a rabbit in the light as the vehicle approaches, but to really be agile and positive if we can. And also to be telling our story for future generations and to really think about what does it mean in the bigger picture. I think there are small wins. There may be quite a lot of challenges imminent, but the story that Ham and Eugenia are telling now, hopefully giving us a slightly absurd, but hopefully hopeful picture for what could happen next if we really, really tried. So stories can be powerful. I hope you can be inspired by this. And Ham and Eugenia, over to you. Please tell us your story.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And it goes like this.
Once upon a time, an alien appeared.
Enormous and happy, but without a beard.
Who from all walks of life came to see.
This strange being who had a decree.
The alien said, in peace.
And to advise you on how to make climate change, conflict, and inequity cease.
Many were suspicious and many feared.
But many sang and many cheered.
Accountants, miners, and keepers of zoos.
Generals, presidents, and miners too.
Some of the brightest and some of the smartest.
Scientists, globalists, and some street artists.
People from nations so far away.
People with dogs and people so grey.
Care and people who lie.
And people who find it difficult to say goodbye.
Some stood defiant and some bent the knee.
But one thing for sure, no one could agree.
For 1 year they shouted and bleated and cried.
And argued and squabbled and bickered and sighed.
But finally, and here, no one knows why,
A decision was made to give it a try.
to stop and to listen to the visitor from afar.
Perhaps there was wisdom in this alien from the stars.
But when they looked at the strange harbor,
Leaving only a note that left them forlorn.
back in 500 years I will be.
For a cup of coffee or maybe some tea.
What will we do without the aliens' advice?
To know what to do would have been so nice.
People were about to embark once again.
In bitter debate and arguments when,
A little girl at the back raised her hand and it said,
hey, but thanks to the alien, we've had a good day.
after a year of squawking with no end in sight,
We found that with compassion and hope, we don't need to fight.
we don't need to quibble or grumble or moan.
Or grouse or mutter or even throw stones.
Everyone nodded and everyone shook hands.
Everyone agreed and did stunning handstands.
The aliens
As promised,
returned in 500
to
years.
rapturous applause and so many cheers.
Climate change, conflict, inequity were things of the past.
So nice to know that some things do not last.
Que
Thank you.
bizarro.
Que bizarro.
Thank you.
Aminya, thank you so very much for that inspiring performance. There cannot be a better way to wrap up what has been an absolutely remarkable development in Climate Days. A huge round of applause for our wonderful audience, for all our wonderful panelists. And I just want to end by underlining the huge contribution of our partners, IIED, Dan Church Aid, the Global Resilience Partnership, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, the Wellcome Trust, and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. In these financially constrained times, the commitment of these organizations to keeping this community together is hugely appreciated. That's it. A big thank you and see you all very soon.